Picture this. Deep in the ruins of a forgotten battlefield, buried beneath layers of rubble and millennia of accumulated debris, something stirs. Not the shifting of settling stone or the groaning of corroded metal, but something else. Something that has been waiting in darkness so complete that it has become indistinguishable from death itself. Waiting in a silence broken only by the faint mechanical whisper of life support systems that refuse to fail, even after 20,000 years. And now, that silence is about to be broken. The war machines of the Imperium of man are legendary throughout the galaxy. Among them, few inspire the mixture of awe and horror, quite like the Dreadnought. These towering mechanical sarcophagi are not simply weapons or vehicles. They are walking tombs, prisons of ceramite and adamantium that contain the shattered remnants of heroes who should have died with honor on the battlefield. Instead, they were granted what some call the highest blessing and others call the cruelest curse imaginable. They were given the chance to serve beyond death, to fight beyond the limits of mortal flesh, to become something more than human and yet profoundly less. Now imagine one of these warriors has been sleeping not for decades or even centuries, but for 20 millennia. 20,000 years of dreamless void, interrupted only by brief, violent moments of consciousness during wars, whose details have long since faded into the haze of eroding memory. This is not one of the relatively modern Castroferum pattern dreadnoughts that most Imperial citizens might recognize. This is something far older, perhaps a Contemptor, with its elegant, almost ancient Terran lines and technology that even the Adeptus Mechanicus can barely comprehend anymore. Or maybe something even more archaic, a relic from the dark days before the Imperium's unification, when humanity clawed its way through the age of strife. The warrior within has seen empires rise and fall. The very stars have changed their positions in the time he has slumbered. The Imperium he once knew, if he served during its earliest days, would be unrecognizable now. And through it all, he has slept, locked in stasis, preserved in amniotic fluid that fills what remains of his lungs, his consciousness barely tethered to the broken body that can no longer sustain itself. But now, something else has come to this forgotten place. Something that represents everything this ancient warrior once fought against, albeit in a very different form than the enemies he remembers. The Greenskins have arrived. The Orks, those brutal, savage, and terrifyingly effective Xenos who live only for war and the joy of destruction. And in the rubble of this ancient battlefield, they've found something that makes their beady red eyes light up with an emotion that in any other species might be called wonder. They've found him. The scenario we're exploring today is one that captures everything that makes Warhammer 40 Zausen simultaneously fascinating and horrifying. It's a collision between the ancient and the crude, between the nobility of sacrifice and the pure, uncomplicated joy of violence, between the tragedy of eternal service and the simple pleasure of finding something shiny to loot. When Orks discover a dreadnought that has been asleep for 20,000 years, the results are never predictable, always violent, and inevitably tragic in ways that only the grim darkness of the far future can manage. This isn't just a story about a battle. It's a glimpse into what makes the 40k universe so compelling. It's about what happens when the unstoppable force of Ork ingenuity meets the immovable object of Imperial devotion. It's about the horror of waking from a sleep that has lasted longer than most civilizations endure, only to find yourself surrounded by the very enemies you swore to destroy. It's about what the Orks will do when they get their hands on technology they absolutely should not have, and the creative, destructive, and utterly unpredictable ways they'll try to make it work. So let's descend into the darkness of that forgotten tomb. Let's witness the moment when crude hands breach the sacred seal. Let's explore what happens when 20,000 years of sleep come to a violent, chaotic end. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and sometimes that war comes for you even when you've been dead to the galaxy for longer than written history. The Dreadnought a living tom. To understand what the Orks have found, we need to comprehend what a Dreadnought truly is. It's not a tank, it's not a robot, it's not even strictly speaking, a vehicle in the conventional sense. A dreadnought is something far stranger and far more tragic than any of those simple descriptions would suggest. When a space marine falls in battle, their gene, seed is recovered by the chapter's apothecaries, to be implanted in a new aspirant and carry on the warrior's genetic legacy. But for the vast majority of fallen Astartes, that's where the story ends. Death comes quickly and violently in the 41st millennium, and even the enhanced biology of a space marine has its limits. Massive trauma, catastrophic wounds, the sheer brutality of war against Xenos horrors and Chaos abominations all ensure that most brothers who fall will never rise again. But sometimes, a space marine survives wounds that should have killed him. Perhaps he took a direct hit from a plasma weapon that melted through his power armor and scorched away huge portions of his body. Maybe he was caught in an explosion that pulverized his legs and shattered his spine beyond even the considerable powers of Astartes' physiology to repair. Or perhaps he held a critical position against overwhelming odds, accumulating injury after injury until his body was more broken than whole, sustained only by the triple redundancy of his enhanced organs and an iron will that refused to let him die while his brothers still fought. These are the warriors who become dreadnoughts. The selection is far from random. A chapter's tech marines and apothecaries don't entomb just anyone in the sacred chassis of a dreadnought. The warrior must be exceptional, a hero whose tactical knowledge, battlefield experience, and strategic acumen are deemed too valuable to lose. They must be warriors whose deeds have already earned them a place in the chapter's legends, whose names are spoken with reverence, whose leadership has turned the tide of battles that would otherwise have been lost. And they must be capable of surviving the process. Entombment in a dreadnought is not a gentle procedure. What remains of the warrior's body is surgically extracted from his ruined power armor, a process that often involves removing limbs that are beyond saving and organs that no longer function. The remnant is placed into the armored sarcophagus at the dreadnought's core, suspended in nutrient-rich amniotic fluid that will sustain what little organic matter remains. Neural interface cables are driven directly into the brain and spinal column, creating a connection so intimate that the dreadnought's mechanical systems become extensions of the pilot's own nervous system. The transformation is absolute. The warrior can no longer see through eyes, but through optical sensors and targeting arrays. He no longer hears with ears, but through acoustic receptors and vox casters. Every sensation has been translated into data, every human experience filtered through machine logic. Touch becomes pressure readings on armor plating. Temperature becomes thermal sensor data. The very act of breathing, once automatic and unconsidered, becomes the slow cycling of amniotic fluid through lungs that will never taste air again. And then there's the weight of it. Not the physical weight, which the dreadnought's servo, motors and reinforced frame handle without difficulty, but the psychological burden of existing in this state. Space Marines are already post-human, their bodies modified far beyond baseline humanity. But a dreadnought pilot has crossed another threshold entirely. He has become something that cannot easily be called human at all, a consciousness married to a machine in a union that will last until the chassis is destroyed or the organic remnant finally fails. For our 20,000-year-old warrior, his chassis would be something truly special. The dreadnought patterns that exist in the 41st millennium are pale shadows of what the Imperium once produced. The knowledge of how to build them has been slowly eroding for 10,000 years. Ever since the Horus heresy shattered the galaxy and sent humanity stumbling backward into technological regression, a dreadnought from before or during that ancient civil war would likely be a contemptor pattern, or perhaps something even more archaic. Contemptors are sleeker than the boxy Castroferum pattern that dominates modern battlefields, with more elegant lines that hint at the height of human technological achievement during the Great Crusade. Their armor is adamantic, incorporating advanced shielding technology that can withstand punishment that would cripple lesser machines. Their weapons systems are sophisticated beyond anything most tech Marines can properly maintain, let alone replicate, Even more remarkably, the Contemptor's neural interface is vastly superior to later patterns. The connection between pilot and machine is smoother, more intuitive, placing less stress on the organic components. A warrior entombed in a Contemptor can theoretically remain awake and functional for extended periods without the same risk of psychological degradation that plagues pilots of later models. But even the finest technology cannot completely shield the pilot from the reality of their condition. And when that pilot has been sealed in their tomb for 20,000 years, sleeping away the centuries in stasis between battles, the psychological toll becomes almost unimaginable. The Space Marine chapter that originally fielded this Dreadnought may not even exist anymore. 20 millennia is time enough for entire chapters to be destroyed, absorbed into other forces, or lost to the warp. The brothers who fought beside him are certainly dead. Their gene, seed long since harvested and implanted in warriors who have themselves lived and died a dozen generations over. The enemies he fought may have been wiped out or evolved into something he wouldn't recognize. The very Imperium he serves has changed beyond recognition. And through it all, he has slept. Not the natural sleep that brings dreams and rest, but the enforced unconsciousness of stasis, where time has no meaning and consciousness simply ceases. Each time he wakes, it's like being torn from death itself, his awareness suddenly reasserting itself in a body that isn't truly a body anymore. In a galaxy that has moved on without him. The chapter's tech marines would have maintained the Dreadnought with religious devotion during his active service. Sacred oils would have been applied to the joints and servos. Litanies of preservation would have been chanted over the armor plating. Every weapon would have been blessed by the chapter's chaplains. The sarcophagus itself would have been treated as the holy relic it was, a vessel containing not just a warrior, but a living link to the chapter's past. But 20,000 years is a long time, even for such devotion. Perhaps the chapter that built this Dreadnought was wiped out in some ancient campaign, leaving their honored ancients behind on a battlefield they could never reclaim. Perhaps the Dreadnought was thought lost or destroyed, marked as fallen in records that have themselves been lost 100 times over. Or perhaps he was deliberately left behind, placed in a hidden vault as a safeguard, a last resort to be awakened only in the direst need, and then that need never came. Or those who knew of his existence died before they could return. Whatever the reason, he has been alone in the darkness for longer than most human civilizations endure. The life support systems continue their work with machine patience, maintaining the delicate balance that keeps the organic remnant alive. The power cells, designed by artificers whose knowledge is now lost, continue to provide energy with an efficiency that would astound modern tech priests. The stasis field keeps consciousness suspended in the moment between thoughts, stretching seconds into millennia. And in this state, neither alive nor dead, neither fully machine nor remotely human, the ancient warrior waits. His last conscious thoughts, before the stasis claimed him, might have been of battle, of brothers falling around him, of enemies broken before his weapons, of duty fulfilled and oaths kept. Thoughts that have remained frozen unchanging for 20,000 years, until the Orks came digging through the rubble. 20,000 years of sleep, 20,000 years. To put that in perspective, all of recorded human history, from the first written languages to the present day, spans only about 5,000 years. The entire Age of Terror, from humanity's first ventures into space to the unification of Earth under the Emperor, is a fraction of that time. 20,000 years ago, the Imperium as we know it in the 41st millennium didn't exist. The Emperor walked among men in physical form, leading the Great Crusade across the stars. The Primarchs were still loyal sons, and the galaxy trembled before the advance of humanity's righteous expansion. For a Dreadnought pilot, that length of time is not experienced as a continuous existence. It's not like serving for 20,000 years, growing old and wise, and seeing history unfold around you. Instead, it's a series of violent interruptions in an otherwise unbroken darkness. The first awakening after entombment is always the hardest. The pilot's last memory is of their body failing. of pain beyond description, and then the cold comfort of emergency surgery, and the promises of chapter chaplains that service will continue, that honor will be preserved, that the Emperor's work will go on through their sacrifice. Then there's the darkness of the procedure itself, consciousness fading as the organic remnant is sealed away. And then the awakening, the sudden, jarring return of awareness in a form that is no longer recognizably human. The initial confusion as the mind tries to map sensation onto a body that no longer exists. The horror of realizing that sight now comes from optical sensors. That movement requires commanding servos and actuators, that every breath is the slow circulation of amniotic fluid through lungs that will never expand with air again. The first battle is a blur of instinct and training. The tactical knowledge remains sharp, even if the memories of what it felt like to be flesh and blood are already fading. The weapons respond to thought as if they were natural limbs. The armor turns aside blows that would have pulverized a mortal form. And through it all, the pilot clings to the same devotion that sustained them in life, the same unwavering faith in the Emperor and dedication to duty that made them a hero in the first place. Then the battle ends. The enemies are destroyed or driven off. The mission is accomplished. And the Tech Marines return the Dreadnought to the chapter's sacred halls, to the alcoves and vaults where these honored ancients rest between wars. The life support systems shift into a lower mode of operation. The consciousness begins to fade, and the pilot is claimed once more by the darkness of stasis sleep. When they wake again, weeks or months or years might have passed. The exact time frame doesn't matter, because in stasis, there is no experience of time's passage. One moment, the warrior is powering down after battle. The next, they're awakening to new alarms, new threats, new enemies to destroy. The gap between those moments could be a day or a decade, and the pilot would have no way to know the difference. This is how Dreadnought pilots experience their extended service, not as continuous existence, but as a series of violent episodes separated by voids of non-being. Each awakening brings with it a fresh assault on the psyche, a new reminder of what has been lost and what remains. Each battle is fought with the skills and knowledge of countless previous engagements, but also with the growing realization that the world is moving on while the pilot remains frozen in their final moment of mortality. Extended neural interface with a Dreadnought causes immense mental stress. The human mind, even the enhanced and conditioned mind of a space marine, isn't meant to exist in this state. Lethargy creeps in during extended periods of wakefulness. Confusion becomes more common as the organic brain struggles to process sensory input that bears little resemblance to natural human experience. Dyschronometria, the inability to accurately perceive the passage of time, becomes nearly universal among long-serving Dreadnought pilots. And then there's the senility. Not the gentle fading of an old man losing his memories to age, but something far stranger and more disturbing. Dreadnought pilots can forget entire battles, entire campaigns. They can wake up convinced they're fighting wars that ended centuries ago, against enemies that no longer exist. Some become locked into specific moments from their past, reliving the same battle over and over in their minds, even as their weapons tear through very different foes. This is why chapters keep their Dreadnoughts in stasis between battles. It's not just for preservation of the technology or conservation of resources. It's mercy of a sort. The longer a Dreadnought pilot remains awake, the more their mind deteriorates under the strain of existing in a form that should not be possible. The darkness of stasis, for all its horrors, is preferable to the slow dissolution of consciousness that comes with extended wakefulness. But our ancient warrior has been in stasis for far longer than the typical periods between awakenings. 20,000 years is not a series of short sleeps punctuated by battles. It's a singular, unbroken void of unconsciousness that stretches across epochs. And when stasis is maintained for that long, strange things can happen. The organic components of a Dreadnought pilot, preserved in amniotic fluid and sustained by life support systems, don't age in the traditional sense. But they do change. Neural pathways can degrade without the stimulation of periodic awakening. Memories can fragment, not from the stress of wakefulness, but from the sheer weight of time spent in suspension. The consciousness itself can become attenuated, stretched thin across millennia, until it's barely tethered to the organic remnant at all. Some ancient dreadnoughts, when finally awakened after extended periods in stasis, are barely coherent. They speak in fragments of forgotten languages. They reference battles from the Unification Wars or the Great Crusade as if they happened yesterday. They call for brothers who have been dead for 10,000 years, using names that exist nowhere in any current chapter's records. The connection between past and present has become so tenuous that they exist in a permanent state of temporal confusion, experiencing all moments of their existence simultaneously. Others maintain surprising clarity, even after millennia of sleep. These are often the warriors who were interred in the most advanced dreadnought patterns, where the quality of the neural interface and the sophistication of the life support systems can preserve consciousness more effectively. But even they pay a price. The loneliness is profound. Every awakening brings the realization that they have outlived yet another generation of brothers, that the galaxy has moved on without them, that they are relics in every sense of the word. For our ancient contemptor pilot, 20,000 years of stasis would mean awakening to a galaxy utterly transformed. If he served during the Great Crusade, he would remember the Emperor as a living, breathing presence, not the corpse, God sustained by the Golden Throne. He would remember the Primarchs as generals leading humanity's expansion, not as dead martyrs or traitorous demons. The very structure of the Imperium, its institutions and hierarchies and religious fervor, would be alien to him. Even the nature of warfare would have changed. The enemies he fought 20,000 years ago might have included xeno-species that are now extinct, or human kingdoms that refused the Emperor's rule and had to be brought to compliance by force. The tactics and strategies that served him well in those ancient campaigns might be obsolete against the threats of the 41st millennium. The very weapons he carries might be relics, whose maintenance procedures have been forgotten, whose operation relies on technology that can no longer be replicated. And yet, beneath all of this, the core of what he is remains unchanged. He is a warrior of the Emperor, a defender of humanity, a hero who chose to continue serving even when his body failed. That devotion doesn't fade with time. If anything, it becomes more concentrated, more essential, when everything else has been stripped away. The memories might be fragmentary, the understanding of current events incomplete, but the purpose endures. This is what makes Dreadnought pilots so valuable to their chapters, even after millennia of service. They are living repositories of knowledge and experience that would otherwise be lost. They can provide tactical advice based on battles fought long before any current chapter member was born. They can remember the chapter's founding, its original doctrines. The faces of heroes whose names have faded into legend. They are continuity given form, links to a past that the Imperium is always in danger of forgetting. But they are also cautionary tales. Every Dreadnought pilot is a reminder of the price of duty, of what it means to serve beyond death, of the thin line between honor and horror. When younger brothers look upon these towering machines, they see not just powerful weapons but potential futures. They see what might happen to them if they survive terrible wounds. They see the double-edged nature of the honor, of entombment. And now, after 20 millennia of dreamless sleep, our ancient warrior is about to experience something no Dreadnought pilot should ever face. He's about to wake up, not to the careful ministrations of tech marines or the respectful distance of chapter serfs, but to the crude, violent, enthusiastic attention of the Orks. He's about to discover that the galaxy hasn't just moved on without him. It's moved on so completely that his tomb has become lost property, forgotten and abandoned, fair game for xeno-scavengers who have absolutely no idea what they've found. The awakening, when it comes, will be nothing like the careful reactivations he might dimly remember from his active service. There will be no ritual preparations, no litanies of awakening, no chapter chaplain to ease the transition from stasis to consciousness. Instead, There will be the jarring impact of crude tools breaching the sacred seals. The violation of systems that have remained untouched for 20,000 years. The sudden, violent return to awareness in a form that can barely remember what it means to be human. Surrounded by the enemies he swore to destroy. And in that moment, 20,000 years of sleep will end in the most violent awakening imaginable. The Orks, lords of salvage, while our ancient warrior has slept away the millennia in his tomb of adamantium and ceramite, the Orks have been doing what Orks do best. They've been fighting, looting, building, destroying, and generally causing mayhem across the galaxy with an enthusiasm that borders on the religious. To understand what happens when they find the Dreadnought, we need to understand what makes Orks tick. Particularly when it comes to their relationship with technology and their absolute mania for salvaging anything that looks remotely useful. Orks are not subtle creatures. They don't engage in complex political maneuvering or delicate diplomatic negotiations. They don't build vast philosophical frameworks or agonize over moral questions. What Orks do is fight, and they do it with a purity of purpose that other species can barely comprehend. For an Ork, life is simple. You fight because fighting is what Orks do. You fight to prove you're the strongest. You fight to take stuff from other Orks or from the enemy. You fight because it's fun. And when you're not actively fighting, you're preparing for the next fight or arguing about the last one. This mentality extends to how Orks interact with technology. They don't build things because they need them, or because careful engineering requires certain components. Orks build things because they have a vision of something that would be really good at killing the enemy. And they're going to make that vision real whether the laws of physics agree or not. And here's where things get truly bizarre. Ork technology shouldn't work. By all the established principles of physics, chemistry, and engineering, the ramshackle assemblages of scrap metal, spare parts, and wishful thinking that Orks call weapons and vehicles should fall apart the moment they're activated. A shooter that's literally just bits of pipe welded together with ammunition that consists of whatever metal scraps were lying around shouldn't be able to fire with any accuracy or reliability. A truck built from the cannibalized remains of 3 different vehicles, none of which were originally trucks, shouldn't be able to move, let alone travel at high speeds while bristling with weapons. But it does work. It works because Orks possess a latent psychic field that makes reality conform to their collective expectations. If enough Orks believe something is true, it becomes true within certain limits. They believe red vehicles go faster, so red vehicles do go faster when Orks are driving them. They believe that a gun will fire if it looks like a gun, and they pull the trigger hard enough, so it does fire, despite having no coherent mechanism for doing so. They believe that a bomb will make a bigger explosion if it's painted yellow, and the resulting blast is indeed more powerful than it would otherwise be. This isn't conscious magic or deliberate psychic manipulation. Orks don't know they're doing it, and they'd probably think the whole idea was stupid if you tried to explain it to them. From an Ork's perspective, these are just obvious facts about how the universe works. Of course red vehicles are faster. Of course a gun with more barrels shoots more. Of course you can make a functional engine from random bits of scrap, as long as it makes the right kind of noise. These things are self-evident truths, and the fact that they only seem to work for Orks never occurs to them. This psychic gestalt phenomenon is what makes Ork technology so maddeningly effective despite being so utterly crude. A human trying to use an Ork weapon would find it nearly impossible to operate, because they don't have the unconscious psychic field to make up for all the engineering shortcuts and impossible components. But in the hands of an Ork, surrounded by other Orks whose collective belief reinforces the weapon's functionality, it becomes a devastatingly effective tool of destruction. The Orks who maintain and build this technology are called mech boys, and they occupy a special place in Ork society. While all Orks have some instinctive understanding of how their technology works, mech boys take it to another level. They're driven by an almost compulsive need to tinker with machines, to build new contraptions. to improve existing weapons and vehicles in ways that make perfect sense to them and no sense whatsoever to anyone else. Mech boys don't learn their trade through formal education or apprenticeship in the traditional sense. Their knowledge is instinctive, encoded in their genetic makeup by the same ancient bioengineering that created the orc species in the first place. A mech boy knows how to build a particular type of weapon or vehicle the same way other animals know how to build nests or dig burrows. It's not learned behavior, but innate programming that surfaces as the orc matures. This means that mech boys can create increasingly complex devices without really understanding the underlying principles of how they work. A mech boy might build a functional force field generator using parts scavenged from 3 different sources, none of which individually had anything to do with force field technology. And when asked how it works, his answer would essentially be, well, you put this bit here, and then it makes the force field. In it, the fact that human scientists would need decades of study and access to manufacturing facilities that don't exist anymore to create the same device is irrelevant. The mech boy just knows what needs to go where, and it works. Among the orc clans, one stands out for its absolute obsession with looting. The Death Skulls believe that the color blue brings luck, and they paint everything they own in various shades of blue to maximize their fortune. But more relevantly, they believe that anything not nailed down is theirs by right, and anything that is nailed down just needs a bit more effort to acquire. Death Skulls are legendary even among other orcs for their ability to steal anything that isn't actively being guarded, and sometimes things that are. To a Death Skull, the entire battlefield is a shopping opportunity. While other orcs are focused on fighting the enemy, Death Skulls are always keeping an eye out for useful salvage. That Imperial tank that just got its tracks blown off. Perfect, it'll make great parts for a looted wagon. That Space Marine who just fell in battle. His armor has some really nice plates that would look great on a war boss's mega armor. That strategic objective everyone's fighting over. Sure, but what about all this scrap lying around that nobody's paying attention to? This mentality means that Death Skulls are incredibly resourceful. While other clans might need to wait for their mech boys to build new equipment, Death Skulls just help themselves to whatever the enemy leaves lying around. They've been known to strip entire battlefields, clean of salvageable material, carting off weapons, armor, vehicle parts, and anything else that looks remotely useful or just shiny enough to be worth taking. And the truly terrifying thing is how effective this approach is. Looted Imperial vehicles, once they've been properly orcified by enthusiastic mech boys, can be just as dangerous as they were in Imperial hands, if not more so. A looted Lemon Russ tank might be covered in crude armor plating and festooned with additional weapons that have no business being there, but it's still a Lemon Russ at its core, with all the firepower that implies. Mech boys take particular delight in working on looted equipment. To them, it's like getting to play with someone else's toys. Except you're allowed to take them apart, add bits to them, paint them in better colors, and generally improve them according to proper orc aesthetics. The fact that these improvements often involve welding spikes onto everything, adding more guns than the original chassis was designed to carry, and painting the whole thing in garish colors doesn't diminish their enthusiasm. There's also an element of technical challenge involved. Imperial technology is different from orc technology, built according to principles that mech boys don't consciously understand, but can often work around through instinct and trial and error. Getting a looted vehicle to work properly requires figuring out which bits are actually important and which can be replaced with good orc engineering. It requires understanding how to interface orc systems with Imperial ones. It requires solving all sorts of technical problems. And the fact that the solutions often involve hitting things with hammers until they work doesn't make the achievement any less real. When orcs encounter military equipment, their first instinct is to evaluate it for looting potential. Is it bigger than what they currently have? Is it shootier? Does it have interesting bits they could use for other projects? Could it be made more orky with some modifications? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then it becomes a target for acquisition, preferably through violence, but theft works too. Space Marine equipment holds particular appeal for Orks. Space Marines are among the toughest enemies Orks regularly face, which means their gear must be pretty good. A Space Marine helmet makes an excellent trophy, proving that the Ork who took it managed to kill one of the Imperium's finest warriors. Space Marine weapons, once properly modified to Ork standards and painted in more suitable colors, can be devastating additions to an Ork arsenal. And Space Marine vehicles, properly looted and enhanced, become prized possessions that Orks will fight over among themselves. But the truly big prizes are the things most Orks never get to see, let alone loot. Imperial Titans, those god machines that tower over battlefields, are the ultimate salvage score. There are legendary stories among Orks of particularly cunning or lucky warbands that manage to bring down a Titan and claim it as loot. Some Orks claim that the truly skilled can loot anything, including things that shouldn't be lootable. Which brings us to what happens when a band of Orks, probably including several enthusiastic mech boys and possibly some death skulls, stumbles across something they've never seen before. Something old beyond their capacity to measure. Something that looks like it might be a really good walker of some kind, the sort of thing that would make other Orks green with envy. Something that's clearly been here for a very long time, just waiting for the right Orks to come along and claim it. They've found a Dreadnought. And not just any Dreadnought, but an ancient one, a relic from an age they can't even begin to comprehend. To them, it's the find of a lifetime. To the warrior sleeping inside, it's about to become a nightmare beyond anything he could have imagined during his 20,000 years of dreams. The discovery, the Ork warband had been on this world for 3 weeks, and they were having the time of their lives. The planet was a ruin, abandoned by whatever humans had once lived here, but ruins meant salvage, and salvage meant opportunities. Every broken building could hide useful scrap. Every collapsed structure might contain ancient weapons or armor or machinery that could be torn apart and rebuilt into something properly Orky. Boss Urgrot was a goth. All business when it came to fighting, but even he had to admit that his Death Skull allies had a point about looting. Why fight over empty ground when you could fight over ground that had loads of good stuff lying around? The fact that the Death Skulls kept trying to claim the best salvage before anyone else could get to it was annoying, but that was just how things worked. If the Goths wanted the best loot, they should be faster. The warband had been systematically working through what looked like it might have been some kind of military complex in the ancient past. The architecture was all wrong for normal humans, too big, too heavily armored, built to withstand attacks that would level ordinary buildings. This had been a fortress of some kind, which meant it probably contained exactly the sort of military hardware that made Ork hearts beat faster. Mechboy Clogbash was in his element. He'd already claimed half a dozen interesting bits and pieces, including what looked like it might have once been part of a power generator, and several chunks of metal that would make excellent armor, plating once he'd properly worked them over. But the real prize was what his grot workers had found in the lower levels of the complex. They'd been digging through collapsed chambers for days, and most of what they'd found was just rubble. But then they'd hit something different. A section of wall that wasn't just thick, but impossibly thick. Adamantium. Or something like it, the kind of material you only used when you absolutely, positively needed to make sure nothing could get through. And where there was that kind of protection, there was usually something worth protecting. It took 2 days of work with industrial cutting equipment, half of which broke down and had to be repaired or replaced, before they finally breached the wall. Behind it was a chamber, sealed and pristine despite the millennia of neglect. And in that chamber, covered in dust but otherwise intact, was something that made every Ork present stop and stare. It was a walker of some kind, that much was obvious. Bipedal, heavily armored, with what looked like weapon mounts on both arms. The design was strange, more elegant than the typical blocky Imperial walkers they'd encountered before. with curves and lines that suggested an aesthetic sense beyond simple function. It was also huge, easily 3 times the height of an orc, towering even over boss Urgrot, who was himself larger than average. But what really caught their attention was how intact it was. This wasn't a wreck they'd have to rebuild from scratch. This was a functioning machine, or at least something that looked like it could be made to function with the right application of mechboy expertise. The armor showed no signs of battle damage. The weapons appeared complete. Even the paint, though faded with age, was still visible in places, showing colors and heraldry that meant nothing to the orcs but looked suitably impressive. Clogbash approached the machine with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for unexploded ordnance or his own more volatile inventions. His trained mechboy eye took in the details that the other orcs missed. This wasn't just old, this was ancient. The design patterns were wrong for anything he'd seen before. The materials were of a quality that even he, with his instinctive understanding of metallurgy, could tell was exceptional. This was a relic from before whatever catastrophe had turned this fortress into a tomb. "What is it, boss?" one of the boys asked, showing the kind of deference that orcs normally only gave to things that could kill them efficiently. Clogbash ran a hand along the armor plating, feeling the perfect smoothness of alloys that had been forged by techniques no current mechboy understood. "Dunno exactly," he admitted. "Some kind of Hume Walker, but old. Really old. Look at them joints, look at how it's put together. This ain't like them clunky boxes the Imperials use now. This is proper engineering, this is. Can we loot it?" Another orc asked, because that was always the most important question. "Oh, we're looting it," Clogbash confirmed, his eyes gleaming with enthusiasm. "Question is, does it still work, or do we gotta fix it first?" The investigation began in earnest. Grots were sent scurrying over the Dreadnought's surface, looking for access panels and hatches. Mech boys examined the weapon systems, trying to figure out what they were designed to fire and whether they had any ammunition stored. The boss stood back and watched, already imagining the respect he'd command once he had his own ancient walker to stomp around in. They found the first access panel after an hour of searching. It was sealed with a lock mechanism that none of them recognized, but that was hardly an obstacle. A few minutes' work with a plasma cutter, and the panel came free, revealing the complex internal systems of the Dreadnought's maintenance compartment. Clogbash stuck his head inside, shining a crude light source around. What he saw made him whistle appreciatively. Power conduits running through the frame like veins. Servo motors of a design that was simultaneously familiar and alien. Life support systems that were still active, still maintaining their charge after all these years. And at the core, visible through layers of protective plating, something that looked like a sealed sarcophagus. "There's something in here," he called out. "Some kind of box, all sealed up proper like. Still got power run into it too. Was it good loot?" Boss Urgrot called back. "Dunno yet. Gimme a minute." Clogbash pulled back and started really examining the Dreadnought now, looking for clues about what it was and how it worked. The weapons were clearly designed for long, range engagement and close combat, which was sensible enough. The armor was thick enough to shrug off weapons that would demolish lesser machines. The power plant was sophisticated beyond anything he could fully comprehend, but the basic principles seemed sound enough. And then there was that sealed chamber at the core. The more he looked at it, the more curious he became. It wasn't cargo space. It wasn't a pilot's cockpit in the normal sense. It was something else, something designed to keep whatever was inside safe and alive for extended periods. Life support didn't make sense for a walker unless there was something living inside it. "I think," Clogbash said slowly, working through the implications. "I think there's a Hume in here, a Lev 1 sorter, in that box in the middle." The other orcs exchanged glances. A Lev human inside an ancient walker. That was unusual, but not impossible. The Imperials did all sorts of weird things with their technology. "Can we get it out?" one of the boys asked. "Probably," Clogbash admitted. "But we'd have to crack open the box, and I ain't sure what that would do. Might kill whatever's in there. Might wake it up. So, Boss Urgrot rumbled. If it wakes up and wants to fight, we'll crump it. If it don't wake up, we'll take it apart and use the good bits. Either way, we win. It was difficult to argue with that logic, even if Clogbash felt a vague sense that they might be missing something important. This machine had been sealed away for a reason. It had been protected behind walls of adamantium, in a chamber that had survived whatever destroyed the rest of the fortress. That suggested whoever put it here considered it valuable. But then again, that just meant it was valuable loot, didn't it? The mech boys went to work in earnest now. More access panels were opened, more systems were examined. They traced power lines and data conduits, trying to understand how everything connected. They tested the weapon systems carefully, discovering that while there was no ammunition currently loaded, the mechanisms appeared functional. They examined the legs and joints, marveling at the engineering that allowed something this heavy to move with what must have been considerable agility. And all the while, they worked their way closer to that central sarcophagus, to the mystery at the heart of this ancient machine. They could see now that the entire Dreadnought was essentially built around that central chamber, with everything else serving to protect and support whatever was inside. The armor wasn't just defensive plating, it was a shell for the sarcophagus. The weapons weren't just weapons, they were extensions of whatever controlled the machine from within. Clogbash found himself both excited and oddly nervous. This was the kind of find that mech boys dreamed about. A piece of technology so advanced and well made that just understanding how it worked would be an achievement. But there was something unsettling about it too. Something in the careful preservation of systems, in the ongoing power draw to that central chamber, that suggested this wasn't just a machine that had been mothballed. This was a tomb, and they were about to crack it open. Right then, he said, gathering his tools. Let's see what's in here. The other mech boys crowded around as Clogbash began working on the seals protecting the sarcophagus. They were sophisticated mechanisms, designed to maintain perfect integrity even in the most extreme conditions. But sophistication didn't make them invulnerable to an orc with a plasma cutter and a complete disregard for the sanctity of ancient Imperial technology. The first seal gave way with a hiss of escaping gases. The second required more work, but eventually yielded. The third was trickier, involving some kind of electronic lock that Clogbash had to bypass by simply cutting through the surrounding material. And then, with a sound like a tomb opening for the first time in centuries, the final seal began to release. Inside the fortress, in the chamber where an ancient warrior had slept for 20,000 years, systems that had been dormant for millennia suddenly activated. Sensors detected the breach. Life support shifted from minimal maintenance to full activation. Neural interfaces that had been idle for longer than civilizations suddenly surged with activity. And deep within the amniotic fluid, in the broken remnant of a body that should have died on a battlefield so long ago that even the name of the world had been forgotten, consciousness began to stir. The ancient warrior was waking up, and the first thing he would see when his optical sensors came online would be the leering faces of orcs, illuminated by the crude lights of their cutting tools, staring into his tomb with expressions of delighted curiosity. The awakening was about to begin, and it would be nothing like any of the careful reactivations this warrior had experienced in his long service to the Emperor. The mech boys get to work the moment the seals began to release. Clogbash knew something was different. This wasn't like cracking open a simple storage compartment or accessing a deactivated system. The machine was responding to the breach, and not in the passive way dead technology reacted to interference. Systems throughout the Dreadnought were powering up, indicators lighting across panels that had been dark moments before. "Oi," one of the other mech boys said nervously, "it's doing something." "Yeah, I can see dat," Clogbash replied, his attention divided between the increasingly active sarcophagus and the warning lights appearing on various access panels. Whatever was in there was waking up, and the machine was preparing to support it. The smart thing to do would probably be to back away, let whatever was happening finish, and then deal with the consequences. But orcs aren't built for caution, and mech boys especially aren't inclined to stop when they're in the middle of something interesting. Besides, they'd already committed to opening the sarcophagus. Might as well see it through. More seals released, each one accompanied by a hiss of equalizing pressure and the groan of mechanisms that hadn't moved in millennia. The Dreadnought's power systems surged, drawing on reserves that had been untapped for 20,000 years. Through the gaps in the armor plating, the Orks could see amniotic fluid beginning to circulate, pumps working to refresh the medium that sustained whatever was inside. "What if it tries to fight us?" a boy asked, gripping his chopper a bit tighter. Boss Urgrot laughed. "Den we fight it back. Been a while since we had a proper scrap. Besides, look at it, it ain't even moving yet. We'll be ready for it." The final seal released with a sound like a pressure door opening. The armored front of the sarcophagus, which had been seamlessly integrated with the Dreadnought's chassis, now stood slightly open, revealing glimpses of the interior. Lights flickered on inside, dim emergency illumination that painted everything in pale blue. Clogbash peered into the gap, shining his light inside. What he saw made him pause. The interior of the sarcophagus was filled with thick, viscous fluid that looked almost like oil but moved like water. Submerged in it, suspended by a complex web of cables and support structures, was something that might have once been human, but was now barely recognizable as such. A torso, or what remained of one. Much of it replaced by cybernetic systems and mechanical augmentation. Arms that terminated not in hands but in interface ports. A head that was more metal than flesh, with cables running directly into where the skull would be. But it was the eyes, or rather the optical sensors that had replaced them, that really caught Clogbash's attention. They were beginning to glow with a faint amber light, slowly brightening as the systems powered up. "Zogan El," Clogbash breathed. "They put a Humi inside the machine. Proper inside it, like. Wired Mimin and everything." The concept wasn't entirely foreign to Orks. They understood that humans sometimes built machines they could ride in or control. But this was something different. This wasn't a pilot in a cockpit. This was a fusion of organic and mechanical so complete that it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. The human hadn't been put into the machine so much as made part of it. "That's right, Orky, dat is," another mech boy said admiringly. "Why make the Humi and the machine separate when you can just stick them together?" The sensors were fully active now, tracking the movement of the Orks standing around the opened sarcophagus. Through the external speakers, heavily filtered through centuries of use and modification, came a sound. Not words, not yet, but a mechanical rumble that might have been an attempt at vocalization. The Dreadnought's systems were still coming online, still establishing connections between the pilot and the machine, still running through startup sequences that hadn't been executed in 20,000 years. Clogbash made a decision. They had the Dreadnought open, and whatever was inside was waking up whether they liked it or not. Now was the perfect time to really examine it, to understand how it worked, and to figure out how they could make it better. "Right, boys," he said, pulling out his tools. "Let's have a proper look at this thing while it's still getting itself sorted. I want to know how it works, what makes it go, and what we can loot off it." The other mech boys eagerly joined in, their earlier nervousness forgotten in the excitement of technical investigation. They traced power lines and found the main reactor, a compact unit of extraordinary sophistication that was putting out more energy than should have been possible from something that size. They examined the servo motors and actuators that allowed the Dreadnought to move, marveling at the precision of the engineering. They looked at the weapon systems, trying to understand the targeting mechanisms and feed systems. And they poked at the sarcophagus itself, examining the life support systems, the neural interfaces, the complex web of technology that kept the organic components alive and connected to the machine. They didn't understand most of what they were seeing, not really, but that was normal for mech boys. Understanding came through doing, through taking things apart and putting them back together, through trial and error and the occasional violent explosion when something didn't work as expected. Boss Urgrot watched the proceedings with growing satisfaction. This was turning out even better than he'd hoped. Not only did they have an ancient walker to loot, but it was one with a live pilot who might be able to be convinced to work for them. Or if not, well, they could always kick him out and stick one of the boys in instead. Either way, they were going to end up with something impressive. Inside the Dreadnought, consciousness was returning in fragments. The warrior who had been sleeping for 20,000 years was experiencing a reactivation unlike any he'd known before. There were no tech marines chanting litanies, no chaplains offering prayers for the awakening. Instead, there were the crude vibrations of Xeno's technology, the inexpert hands of creatures who had no idea what they were interfering with, the violation of seals that should never have been breached. The pilot's first conscious thought, as systems came online and awareness returned, was confusion. The startup sequence was wrong. Everything felt wrong. The neural interfaces were connecting properly. Sensation was returning, but the environment was all wrong. Where were the familiar sounds of the chapter's fortress monastery? Where were the respectful voices of the tech marines? And then the external sensors finished initializing, and the pilot saw what was crowding around the opened sarcophagus. Greenskins, Orks. The enemies he had fought across countless battlefields were here, inside his tomb, poking at systems that only the most skilled tech marines should have access to. They'd breached the sarcophagus. They were examining him like he was some kind of curiosity, some piece of salvage to be evaluated and exploited. The rage that flooded through the pilot's consciousness was absolute. 20,000 years of sleep, and he woke to this. To find his sacred tomb violated by Xeno's scum. His machine form opened and examined by crude hands. His very existence treated as nothing more than interesting salvage. The Dreadnought's weapon systems, which had been powering up gradually as part of the standard reactivation sequence, suddenly surged to full combat readiness. The pilot's training, honed across millennia of warfare, asserted itself instantly. Threat assessment, multiple Xenos contacts in close proximity, tactical situation compromised, sarcophagus open, weapon systems unclear. Primary directive: eliminate the Xenos threat. But the pilot quickly discovered a problem. The weapon systems weren't loaded. The mech boys' examination had determined that much already. The assault cannon had no ammunition. The power fist's energy field wasn't active. 20,000 years without maintenance had left the Dreadnought combat, ready in terms of mobility and core systems, but completely unarmed in terms of loaded weapons, which meant the pilot would have to improvise. Clogbash was elbow, deep in the Dreadnought's left arm assembly, trying to understand how the power fist's energy field generator worked, when the whole arm suddenly moved. Not the slow, deliberate movement of a machine powering up, but a fast, violent snap that sent him flying backward. "Oi," he yelled, more surprised than hurt. "It's movin'." The Dreadnought's legs engaged, servos that hadn't moved in 20,000 years, suddenly activating with smooth precision. The ancient warrior was standing up, emerging from the alcove where he'd rested for longer than most species' civilizations endured. The Orks scrambled backward, some reaching for weapons, others just trying to get clear. This was the moment they'd been half expecting since the sarcophagus opened. The moment when the ancient machine decided to wake up properly and see who had been messing with it. Boss Urgrot stepped forward, his massive frame making him easily the largest Ork present. "Oh," he bellowed. "You're awake, Den! Good! Now you can tell us how this thing works proper like. And maybe we'll let you stick around." The Dreadnought's optical sensors focused on the boss with an intensity that made even that hardened warrior pause. When the voice came through the external speakers, it was like gravel scraping across steel, mechanical and harsh but unmistakably conscious and aware. "Xenos filth," the voice said, in low Gothic heavily accented by languages that hadn't been spoken in 10,000 years. "You dare defile this sacred machine. You dare violate the tomb of a warrior of the Emperor. Sacred air." Urgrot grinned, showing his massive tusks. "Looks like proper good salvage to me. Tell you what, you work for me now, and I won't have de mechs pull you apart to see you tick. Fair deal dat. The Dreadnought's response was immediate. Despite having no ammunition loaded, despite being in a tactically compromised position, despite having just woken from the longest sleep imaginable, the ancient warrior did what he had been trained to do for his entire service to the Emperor. He attacked. The Dreadnought's fist, even without its energy field active, was still several tons of ceramite and adamantium moving at considerable speed. It caught Boss Urgrot in the chest before the Ork could properly react, sending him flying across the chamber to crash into a wall with enough force to crack the ancient stone. The other Orks responded instantly, because that's what Orks do. The boys surged forward with choppers and shooters, eager for a scrap with this ancient warrior. The mech boys scattered, some trying to find cover, others just trying to get a better view of what was happening. And in the center of it all, the Dreadnought stood, a warrior from an age of legends suddenly thrust into a battle he couldn't possibly have prepared for. No ammunition, no fully functional weapons. Surrounded by Xenos in a place he didn't recognize, with no idea how he'd come to be here, or what had happened in the time he'd slept. But he was still a space marine. He was still a warrior who had earned the honor of entombment through deeds that lesser beings couldn't imagine. And he was absolutely not going to let a bunch of Orks take him apart for salvage without the fight of their lives. The true battle was about to begin, and it would be unlike anything either the ancient warrior or the Ork warband had experienced before. The awakening, the pilot's consciousness, was still fragmenting between past and present, between the last memories before sleep and the shocking reality of now. The neural interface was working perfectly, every sensor and actuator responding with the precision that 20,000 years of stasis, preserved systems could provide. But the mind directing those systems was struggling to process what it was experiencing. The tactical systems, running on trained instinct, were providing constant updates. Multiple hostiles, close range, no ranged weapons available, sarcophagus compromised, unknown location, no friendly forces detected. The analysis was clear and damning. This was the worst possible tactical situation, made worse by the complete absence of context for how he'd arrived here. The last memory the pilot could clearly access was of a battlefield. The details were hazy, distorted by time, and the peculiar way Dreadnought pilots experienced memory. There had been enemies, he remembered that much, and brothers fighting beside him. Their armor-bearing heraldry that seemed right, but also strangely unfamiliar when he tried to focus on the specifics. And then the command to stand down, to return to the fortress monastery, to sleep again until need called him forth. Had that been 20 years ago? 200. The pilot had long ago lost the ability to accurately track time between awakenings. Each sleep felt instantaneous, consciousness simply ceasing and then resuming with no sense of duration. But something felt different about this awakening. The very air tasted wrong through his chemical sensors. The architecture of this chamber didn't match any fortress monastery he could recall. And the Orks, the presence of the greenskins was completely inexplicable. Why would Orks be inside an Imperial fortress? Why would they have access to his tomb? Where were the tech marines, the chaplains, the brothers who should have been here? Boss Urgrot pulled himself from the rubble, shaking his head to clear it. That had been a solid hit. He'd give the ancient machine that much. His armor had taken most of the impact, but he could feel bruising across his chest where the fist had connected. It had been a while since anything had hit him that hard. "That's more like it," he roared, his voice filled with genuine delight. "A proper fight! Come on, Den, let's see what you're really made of." The Dreadnought turned to face the charging Orks, and the pilot made rapid calculations. His close combat weapon had no power field, but the mass and strength of the Dreadnought chassis meant it could still function as a devastating bludgeon. His assault cannon was empty, but the weapon housing itself was solid enough to serve as a backup weapon. And the chassis itself was armored heavily enough to withstand significant punishment from the crude weapons the Orks were wielding. The first Ork boy reached him. Swinging a massive chopper in an overhead arc, that would have bisected a normal human. The Dreadnought's arm came up, the assault cannon housing blocking the blow with a shower of sparks. The return strike was immediate and devastating, the Dreadnought's other fist catching the Ork in the torso and crushing him against the floor with terrible force. More Orks surged forward, and the chamber descended into chaos. The Dreadnought fought with the skill of centuries of combat experience, every movement precise and economical despite the fury driving them. Each strike was calculated to maximize damage while maintaining defensive positioning. Each movement was designed to use the Dreadnought's superior reach and mass against enemies who might be individually weaker but vastly outnumbered him. But the pilot was also aware that something was wrong with his own performance. The movements were there, the muscle memory that had become machine memory serving him well. But the mental processes felt sluggish, disconnected. He couldn't remember the proper litanies of battle. Couldn't recall the names of the brothers he should be fighting alongside. The very prayers to the Emperor that should have been automatic felt distant and uncertain. How long had he been asleep? The question kept surfacing even as he fought, even as his weapons crushed and broke the Orks who came at him. How long since he'd last been awake? And why couldn't he remember clearly? Clogbash watched the battle from relative safety behind an overturned piece of ancient machinery. The Dreadnought was impressive, he'd give it that. Despite having no proper ammunition and clearly being disoriented from its long sleep, it was holding its own against a dozen Ork boys and doing serious damage in the process. The engineering that allowed such precise, powerful movements was extraordinary. But Clogbash was also noticing things that the others, caught up in the excitement of the fight, were missing. The Dreadnought's movements were showing signs of strain. 20,000 years was a long time even for the best maintained systems. And whatever minimal maintenance the stasis had provided, it hadn't included actually exercising the servo, motors and checking the actuator responses. The machine was operating well, but not perfectly, and against a determined assault, those small imperfections would add up. More importantly, Clogbash could see that the pilot was confused. The ancient warrior wasn't just fighting with tactical precision. He was fighting with the kind of desperation that came from not understanding the situation. Every kill was executed perfectly, but the overall pattern suggested someone who was operating on pure training because conscious thought was failing to provide adequate context. "Stop," Clogbash yelled, his voice cutting through the din of combat. Everybody stop. The Orks, conditioned to respond to a mech boy's commands when he used that particular tone, immediately backed off. The Dreadnought, confronted with enemies who were suddenly withdrawing, hesitated, weapons raised but not striking. "Right," Clogbash said, stepping into the open where the Dreadnought could see him clearly. "I think we got off on the wrong foot, yeah. You're confused, we're curious. And Boss Urgrot's enjoyin' himself too much to think straight. So let's try talkin' instead of crumpin' for a minute, yeah." The Dreadnought's weapons didn't lower, but the pilot's attention was clearly focused on Clogbash now. Through the external speakers, that grinding mechanical voice emerged again. "You are Orks," the pilot said, stating the obvious as if trying to ground himself in facts he could verify. "Greenskin Xenos, enemies of the Imperium, you have breached my tomb. This is a violation of the most severe kind." "Yeah, we looted Day Place," Clogbash agreed cheerfully. "Found you in a sealed room, all tucked away nice and safe. Been there a long time, you ave. Probably forgot about, I reckon." Forgotten. The word seemed to hit the pilot with physical force. "No, I was placed in stasis. My chapter would not forget their ancients. They would return for me when need was dire enough to warrant my reactivation." "Mate," Clogbash said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone, "I don't think your chapter's been here for a long, long time. Da whole place is ruins. Everything's dead and gone. You was just left here, in the dark, sleeping away." The Dreadnought stood motionless for a long moment, processing this information. The pilot's consciousness was trying to reconcile what he was being told with his fragmented memories. Left behind. Forgotten. That couldn't be right. The chapter would never abandon their honored ancients. Would they? But the evidence was difficult to dispute. He was in a ruin, surrounded by orcs who had clearly been scavenging for some time. The seals on his chamber had been untouched for so long that dust had accumulated to significant depth. And most damning of all, he couldn't sense any of the familiar signatures of an Imperial presence. No Vox traffic, no power signatures from other Imperial equipment, no psychic presence of librarians or the distant beacon of the Astronomicon, just silence and orcs. How long? The pilot asked, and there was something broken in that mechanical voice. How long have I been here? Clogbarsh shrugged. Dunno exactly. But this whole place, been dead for ages. Before me, boss. Probably before his boss's boss's boss. You been sleepin' for a proper long time. The Dreadnought's weapons finally lowered. Not in surrender, but in a gesture that suggested the pilot was too overwhelmed to maintain combat readiness. Through the external sensors, he could see the chamber more clearly now. See the details he'd been too focused on combat to notice before. Ancient architecture, styles that seemed simultaneously familiar and alien. Technology that looked imperial, but didn't match any patterns he could clearly recall. And everywhere, the marks of age and abandonment. My chapter, the pilot said. Where are they? What happened? No idea, Clogbarsh admitted. We just came here looking for salvage. Found a fortress ruins, found you in it. Whatever happened to your lot? It happened a long time ago. Boss Urgrot, recovered from the earlier strike and clearly losing interest in conversation, rumbled forward. Look, this is all very touchin' and all, but I got better things to do than stand around while you lot of a chat. You, he pointed at the Dreadnought, can work for me. Or I can have Clogbarsh take you apart and use dar good bits for something more useful. What's it gonna be? The pilot felt the rage returning, but it was different now. Not the clean fury of battle against enemies who clearly deserved destruction, but something more complex. These orcs had opened his tomb, yes. They'd violated sacred seals and poked at systems they didn't understand. But they'd also, inadvertently, given him something he hadn't had in longer than he could remember. They'd given him answers. Terrible answers. Answers that raised 1,000 new questions, but answers nonetheless. He'd been left behind. His chapter was gone. By death or departure or simple passage of time, beyond his capacity to measure. The galaxy had moved on without him, and he'd slept through it all. Dreaming dreams he couldn't remember, losing years and centuries, and perhaps millennia to the void of stasis. And now he was awake. Confronted with the kind of choice that no warrior should have to make. Fight these orcs, and probably be destroyed when they brought superior numbers to bear. Or, I am a warrior of the Emperor, the pilot said, each word carefully enunciated. I do not serve Xenos. I do not compromise with the enemies of humanity. But I also cannot complete my duty if I am destroyed here, in this forgotten place, fighting a battle that serves no purpose. So that's a maybe den. Boss Urgrot grinned. The pilot made a decision that would have been unthinkable during any other period of his long service. I will not fight for you. But I will not fight against you, for now. I need time. Time to understand what has happened. Time to determine if my chapter still exists, if there are any brothers who remember my name, and time to decide what comes next. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't alliance. It was a temporary cessation of hostilities. Driven by a pragmatism that the pilot would have once considered beneath a warrior of his standing. But 20,000 years of sleep, followed by this shocking awakening, had left him adrift in ways that were hard to articulate. He needed to understand his situation before he could determine the appropriate response. Works for me, Clogbarsh said quickly, before the boss could make the situation worse. You rest up. We finish looking around this place, and everybody's happy. And maybe you tell us how some of this old stuff works. Yeah. Educational-like. The Dreadnought stood silent, a towering figure of ancient ceramite and adamantium, housing a consciousness that had been displaced in time by an almost incomprehensible margin. Around him, the orcs began to relax, returning to their examination of the ruins with renewed enthusiasm now that the threat of immediate violence had passed. And deep within the sarcophagus, in the amniotic fluid that had sustained him for 20,000 years, the pilot tried to make sense of a galaxy that had forgotten him. Tried to understand what it meant to wake up to find that everything he'd known was gone, that his service had ended not in glorious battle, but in simple abandonment. He'd survived the awakening, but as he stood there, processing information that no mind should have to bear, the pilot couldn't help but wonder if survival was truly the blessing it was supposed to be, or just another form of the curse that entombment had always represented. The question of what came next remained unanswered, but at least, for now, he was awake, and consciousness, no matter how painful, was better than the endless darkness of stasis sleep, or so he tried to convince himself. The battle ensues. The temporary truce lasted approximately 3 hours. That might seem like a reasonable amount of time for both parties to assess the situation and make rational decisions about their next moves. But this is Warhammer 40k, where rationality tends to take a back seat to violence, and 3 hours of peace between an ancient Imperial warrior and a warband of Orks was actually quite remarkable. The breakdown, when it came, was almost inevitable. Boss Urgrot had been growing increasingly frustrated with the situation. He'd come to this world for a good fight and some quality looting, and while they definitely found quality loot in the form of the Dreadnought, the lack of fighting was starting to irritate him. Orks aren't built for patience, and the boss was particularly short on that particular virtue. Clogbash, meanwhile, had been taking advantage of the cease-fire to continue his examination of the Dreadnought. The ancient warrior had allowed this, partly because he was still too disoriented to form a coherent response, and partly because some small part of him hoped that the mech boy might be able to repair some of the minor damage that 20,000 years had inflicted on his systems. That hope was misplaced. Clogbash was a skilled mech boy by Ork standards, which meant he had an instinctive understanding of how things worked and absolutely no respect for maintaining the original design if he could see a way to improve it. And as he examined the Dreadnought systems, he saw numerous opportunities for improvement. The power plant, for instance, was clearly designed with safety and longevity in mind, but from an Ork perspective, that meant it was operating well below its theoretical maximum output. A few modifications, maybe bypass some of those unnecessary safety systems, and they could probably get significantly more power out of the reactor. The assault cannon was currently empty, but Clogbash had seen similar weapons before. The mechanism looked like it could handle larger caliber ammunition than it was designed for, and with a few adjustments to the feed system and barrel assembly, they could probably make it shoot faster and louder. Sure, it might reduce accuracy and increase wear, but what was the point of a gun if it wasn't as loud and destructive as possible? And the armor plating, while impressive, was clearly too smooth and boring. Some spikes would look really good. Maybe paint it red so it could move faster. Definitely needed more DACA mounted on the shoulders. The pilot, monitoring the mech boy's examination through his external sensors, was experiencing a growing sense of horror as he realized what Clogbash was planning. These weren't repairs or careful restoration. This was desecration, the kind of crude modification that would make any tech priest weep with rage. The sanctity of the machine was being violated by Xeno's hands that had no understanding of the sacred nature of what they were tampering with. "Do not," the pilot said, his mechanical voice carrying a warning tone, "attempt to modify these systems. They are functioning as designed. Your interference will only cause damage." Clogbash looked up from where he'd been examining the power conduits. "Now mate, trust me. I know what I'm doing. This thing could be running way better than it is. Just need a few tweaks, right?" "No," the pilot said firmly. "These systems are the product of the finest artificers the Imperium has ever known. Your primitive understanding of technology is insufficient to make improvements. Stand down." The words were perhaps more insulting than the pilot intended. Calling an Ork's technical expertise primitive was like questioning their ability to fight, a deep blow to their pride. And suggesting that a mech boy should stand down from modifying interesting technology was fundamentally contrary to everything mechboys believed about their role in Orc society. Clogbash bristled. Primitive. You callin' me primitive? Mate, I been building things and fixin' things since before you was, well, since whenever you was made. I know what I'm doing. And this machine needs work whether you like it or not. You will not touch these systems. The pilot repeated, his weapons beginning to power up again. This is your final warning. Or what? Boss Urgrot called from across the chamber, clearly delighted that the situation was escalating toward violence again. You'll fight us. You got no ammo, we got you outnumbered, and Clogbash is the best mech I got. If he says he can make you better, then you're getting improved whether you like it or not. The pilot made a calculation based on pure tactical necessity. If he allowed the mech boy to modify his systems, the sanctity of the machine would be violated beyond repair. If he fought now, he might be destroyed, but at least his chassis wouldn't become some grotesque orc contraption. The choice was between certain desecration and possible death. For a warrior who had served the Emperor for longer than most civilizations endured, that wasn't really a choice at all. So be it, the pilot said, and launched himself forward with startling speed. The Dreadnought crossed the distance to Clogbash in seconds. Fist raised to crush the mech boy before he could defile another system. But Clogbash was quicker than he looked, rolling aside and yelling for help in the same motion. The strike cratered the floor where he'd been standing, sending chunks of ancient stone flying. Boss Urgrot didn't need to be told twice. With a roar of genuine joy, he charged into combat, his power claw crackling with energy. The other orcs followed suit, the boys surging forward with their choppers raised. The mech boys scrambling for cover or grabbing whatever tools could serve as weapons. The battle that erupted was chaotic and brutal, exactly the kind of fight that orcs lived for. The Dreadnought fought with desperate precision, every movement calculated to maximize damage, while minimizing exposure to the orcs' crude but effective weapons. The pilot's centuries of combat experience gave him an edge in tactical awareness, allowing him to predict and counter the orcs' attacks with practiced ease. But the orcs had numbers and enthusiasm on their side. For every greenskin the Dreadnought crushed or threw aside, 2 more took their place. And they were learning from each exchange, adapting their tactics to account for the ancient warrior's superior reach and mass. They came at him from multiple angles, forcing him to divide his attention, preventing him from focusing on single targets. Boss Urgrot was the real threat. His power claw capable of cutting through even the Dreadnought's ancient armor if it landed a solid hit. The boss fought with the kind of reckless aggression that made orcs so dangerous, pressing forward, even when the Dreadnought's fists sent him flying, always getting back up, always coming back for more. The Dreadnought blocked a strike from the power claw with his assault cannon housing, the energy field scoring deep gouges in the adamantium barrel. The return strike caught Urgrot in the shoulder, spinning the massive orc around but not dropping him. Another boy came in from the side, chopper raised, and the Dreadnought's other fist swept him aside hard enough to leave a dent in his armor. But there were too many of them. The pilot was acutely aware that this was a losing battle. His systems were still functioning well, but the lack of proper ranged weapons meant he had to rely entirely on close combat, which favored the orcs' numerical advantage. And every hit he took, even from the crude weapons the boys wielded, was causing minor damage that would accumulate over time. The tactical situation was clear. He couldn't win this fight. Not like this, not against these numbers, not with systems that hadn't been properly maintained in 20,000 years. But he could sell his existence dearly, could take as many of them with him as possible, before they finally brought him down. A chopper struck his leg actuator, cutting through the protective plating and damaging the servo motor beneath. The Dreadnought stumbled, and in that moment of vulnerability, 3 orcs piled onto him from different angles. Their combined weight, while individually insufficient to threaten the chassis, was enough to throw off his balance. The Dreadnought crashed to the floor with a sound like a collapsing building, and immediately the orcs swarmed over him. Choppers struck at joints and vulnerable points. Crude hammers pounded at armor plating. And Boss Urgrot, seeing his opportunity, brought his power claw down in a devastating overhead strike aimed at the Dreadnought's optical sensors. The pilot, operating on pure instinct now, managed to raise an arm to block. The power claw sheared through the assault cannon housing, destroying the weapon completely and sending sparks flying. But it missed the sensors, and more importantly, it gave the Dreadnought the opening he needed. His remaining functional arm swept out in a wide arc, catching multiple Orks and sending them flying. The leg actuators engaged, and despite the damage, managed to provide enough thrust to partially right himself. And in that moment of partial recovery, the ancient warrior made a decision that tactical training suggested was probably suicidal, but instinct insisted was the only option. He charged, not at the Orks directly in front of him, but toward the wall of the chamber, specifically toward the section that looked most structurally compromised. The Dreadnought's mass, combined with the momentum of the charge, was enough to smash through the weakened stone. The wall collapsed in a shower of debris, opening into another section of the ruined fortress, and the Dreadnought kept running, servo motors protesting but functional. Damaged leg actuator causing a pronounced limp, but still providing adequate mobility. Behind him, he could hear the Orks' roars of excitement as they gave chase. Boss Urgrot's voice was loudest of all, bellowing something about proper sport and not letting the Humi get away. The pilot didn't have a plan beyond immediate escape. He didn't know where he was running to, or what he'd do when he got there. The fortress was unfamiliar. His tactical database contained no maps of this location, and for all he knew, he was just running deeper into a dead end. But movement was better than staying trapped in that chamber with overwhelming numbers. He burst through another wall, this time into what might have once been an armory or weapons storage facility. Racks that had once held equipment now stood empty, any useful weapons long since salvaged by whoever had stripped this place before the Orks arrived. But the layout suggested multiple exits, and more importantly, the chamber was larger, giving him room to maneuver. The Orks poured through the breach behind him, and the battle resumed. But now the Dreadnought had space to use his superior mobility, could keep moving rather than being swarmed and overwhelmed. He led the Orks on a running fight through the ruins, using every tactical trick he'd learned across millennia of warfare. He collapsed corridors behind him to slow pursuit, buying precious seconds. He used doorways and choke points to limit how many Orks could engage him at once. He targeted the leaders when possible, trying to disrupt their coordination. And all the while, he was looking for anything he could use as an advantage, any weapon he could claim, any defensive position he could leverage. Clogbash, running with the pack but not directly engaging in combat, was watching the Dreadnought's tactics with professional appreciation. The ancient warrior was good, really good, better than any Humi fighter he'd seen before. The fact that the pilot was managing this level of performance while clearly disoriented and operating with damaged systems was genuinely impressive. But impressive didn't mean invincible. The Dreadnought was slowing down, the damaged leg actuator getting worse with continued use. The armor was accumulating damage from dozens of strikes, and most critically, the pilot had to be exhausted. Maintaining this level of combat intensity after just waking from a sleep that had lasted geological periods of time. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. The Dreadnought rounded a corner into another chamber, looking for the next position to defend. But there was no exit, just walls that had once been part of some larger structure, but now formed a dead end. The pilot tried to turn, to backtrack before the Orks could trap him, but the damaged actuator finally gave out completely, sending him crashing to the floor. Boss Urgrot burst into the chamber, power claw raised, ready to finish this. But Clogbash, following close behind, grabbed the boss's arm. "Wet," the mech boy said. "Don't wreck him. Look, he's done. Leg's gone. He can't get up. We got him." The Dreadnought lay on the floor, unable to rise with only one functional leg. The pilot's consciousness was a storm of rage and frustration, and a kind of grief he couldn't articulate. To have served so long, survived so much only to end like this. Beaten by Orks in a forgotten ruin, his chassis to be stripped for parts. His service ending not in glorious battle, but in simple mechanical failure. Finish it, the pilot said, and there was a kind of weary resignation in that mechanical voice. I will not serve you. I will not allow you to defile my chassis, and this now. Boss Urgrot looked down at the fallen Dreadnought, considering. Then he grinned. Nah, Clogbash is right. You're too useful to just wreck. We'll fix up dat leg, patch up the armor. And then you can do some proper work for us. I would rather be destroyed, the pilot said flatly. Yeah, well, you don't get to choose, the boss replied. Tee him down, boys. Clogbash, you got your wish. Make this thing work proper. And as the Orks swarmed over the fallen Dreadnought, beginning the process of securing him and preparing him for Clogbash's modifications, the pilot felt something he hadn't experienced in 20,000 years of service. He felt true helplessness. Not the helplessness of a broken body being sealed into a machine, which at least carried the promise of continued service, but the helplessness of being at the mercy of enemies who saw him not as a warrior but as salvage, as a thing to be modified and used for purposes that would make a mockery of everything he'd fought for. The battle was over. The Orks had won, and what came next would be worse than any nightmare the pilot had experienced during his long sleep. Possible outcomes. The scenario we've explored raises an important question. What actually happens when Orks find a Dreadnought that's been asleep for 20,000 years? The answer, as with so much in Warhammer 40,000, is that it depends on a vast array of variables. Let's examine the most likely outcomes and the factors that determine which one occurs. Outcome 1. The Ancient destroys the Orks. This is perhaps the most straightforward scenario, and under the right circumstances, it's entirely plausible. A Dreadnought, even one that's been in stasis for 20 millennia, is a fearsome war machine. If the Ancient warrior awakens with full weapons capacity, in a defensible position, and against Orks who are unprepared for serious resistance, the result could be a one-sided massacre in the Dreadnought's favor. The key factors that would lead to this outcome include the condition of the Dreadnought's weapon systems. If the assault cannon is loaded and functional, if the Power Fist's energy field activates properly, the Ancient warrior has the tools to turn a small Ork warband into scattered remains. The superior armor and firepower of even an Ancient Dreadnought pattern is more than a match for Ork boys with choppers and crude shooters. The pilot's experience also matters enormously. Someone who has fought for thousands of years, even if most of that time was spent in stasis, has accumulated tactical knowledge that younger warriors simply cannot match. The ability to read a battlefield, to identify optimal firing positions, to predict enemy movements. These skills don't fade with time in stasis because they're not really memories so much as fundamental patterns of thought. If the Dreadnought can leverage these advantages, the battle might be over in minutes. The Orks would find themselves cut down by weapons they can barely comprehend, wielded by a warrior whose reflexes and precision make their own combat skills look crude by comparison. Boss Urgrot might try to rally his boys for a proper scrap, but if the Ancient warrior is smart enough to target the leaders first, the warband might break and flee before they can organize effective resistance. But this outcome requires everything to go right for the Dreadnought. The stasis must have preserved not just the pilot, but the ammunition stores. The power systems must activate cleanly after 20,000 years of inactivity. The Orks must be poorly organized or lacking in heavy weapons that could threaten the Ancient armor. And the pilot must retain enough clarity of thought, despite the disorientation of awakening, to fight effectively. In the grim darkness of the far future, counting on everything going right is usually a mistake. Outcome 2. The Orks successfully loot it. This is perhaps the most horrifying outcome from the Dreadnought pilot's perspective. But it's also entirely possible given the Orks' natural talent for salvaging and repurposing technology that should be beyond their comprehension. If the Orks manage to subdue the Dreadnought without destroying it completely, they gain access to technology that even most Imperial tech priests would struggle to replicate. A contemptor pattern or other ancient chassis contains systems and materials that modern mechboys have never seen before, and the opportunity to examine and modify such advanced machinery would be irresistible. Clogbash and his fellow mechboys would approach the captured Dreadnought with the enthusiasm of children let loose in a toy store. Every system would be examined, tested, and almost certainly modified in ways that would make the original artificers weep. The assault cannon might be bored out to fire larger ammunition, trading accuracy for raw destructive power. The power plant might be overclocked to provide more energy, never mind the safety systems that are being bypassed. The armor might be covered with additional plates welded on in crude approximation of Ork aesthetics. But here's where Ork technology gets really strange. It might work. The psychic gestalt field that makes Ork machinery function, despite its crude construction, could extend to looted Imperial equipment. The mechboys' modifications, which should by all logic destroy the delicate balance of systems that keep a Dreadnought functional, might instead create something that works through sheer Ork belief that it should work. The pilot's fate in this scenario is particularly grim. The Orks might decide to keep him alive, treating him as a component of the machine rather than a person. Or they might try to remove him and install an Ork pilot instead, a process that would almost certainly kill the ancient warrior. Or, worst of all, they might keep him conscious and trapped in his own chassis while they modify it, forcing him to experience the desecration of his sacred machine form while being powerless to stop it. This outcome requires the Orks to successfully subdue the Dreadnought without destroying it, which means either catching it before it fully activates or overwhelming it through superior numbers before it can mount an effective defense. It also requires a mechboy skilled enough to understand at least the basics of how the Dreadnought functions, which is more likely with an ancient pattern that has some similarities to Ork walker technology. Outcome 3: mutual destruction. In this scenario, both sides pay a terrible price. The Dreadnought manages to destroy a significant portion of the Ork warband, but sustains damage that either kills the pilot or renders the chassis inoperable. The Orks get their fight and prove their strength, but lose so many boys that their overall mission is compromised. This outcome often results from a protracted battle, where neither side can gain a decisive advantage. The Dreadnought's superior firepower and armor keep the Orks at bay, but their numbers and resilience prevent a quick victory. The pilot accumulates damage from hundreds of small strikes, each individually insufficient to penetrate the armor, but collectively wearing down systems that haven't been maintained in 20,000 years. Boss Urgrot and any other knobs in the warband would push their boys forward relentlessly, accepting casualties that would make other species retreat. Orks don't fear death the way humans do, and a good scrap against a worthy opponent is its own reward. If the ancient warrior fights well enough, the Orks might actually respect it enough to try harder to kill it, which paradoxically makes mutual destruction more likely. The critical moment might come when the Dreadnought's power plant takes damage, or when a lucky Ork manages to breach the sarcophagus. The resulting detonation or system failure could take out everyone in the immediate area, leaving the chamber filled with the bodies of Orks and the shattered remains of a warrior who served far longer than anyone should have to. Outcome 4: unusual alliances. This is the least likely outcome, but in Warhammer 40,000, stranger things have happened. What if the ancient warrior and the Orks reach some kind of understanding? Not an alliance in any formal sense, but a mutual recognition that they can both benefit from temporary cooperation. The pilot might realize that these Orks could provide transportation off this dead world, access to resources that could help repair his damaged systems, or information about what's happened in the galaxy during his long sleep. The Orks might recognize that a fully functional ancient Dreadnought, even one that won't fight for them directly, is too valuable to simply destroy or mindlessly loot. Such an arrangement would be temporary at best. The ancient warrior would be looking for the first opportunity to escape and return to Imperial space. The Orks would be constantly tempted to just take the Dreadnought apart and use the pieces. But in the short term, both parties might find that cooperation serves their interests better than continued conflict. This scenario requires both sides to be unusually pragmatic, which is asking a lot from both an Ork warband and a space marine who's just woken up to find his entire world gone. But it's not impossible, especially if the pilot retains enough mental clarity to think strategically rather than just reacting with rage to the violation of his tomb. Determining factors: several key elements determine which outcome occurs. The condition of the Dreadnought when awakened is critical. Full weapons and ammunition dramatically favor the ancient warrior. Damaged or depleted systems favor the Orks. The sophistication of the chassis matters too, with more advanced patterns being both more powerful and more vulnerable to irreplaceable damage. The composition of the Ork warband makes a huge difference. A small group of boys led by an overconfident Nob might be crushed easily. A larger warband with multiple mech boys and heavy weapons could overwhelm even a fully functional Dreadnought through sheer weight of fire. The pilot's mental state, after 20,000 years of sleep, cannot be overlooked. A warrior who retains full clarity despite the long stasis will fight far more effectively than one who's confused and disoriented. The difference between tactical precision and instinctive flailing could determine survival. The environment plays a role as well. Open ground favors the Dreadnought's ranged weapons and mobility. Tight corridors and collapsed structures might allow Orks to swarm and overwhelm, despite being individually outmatched. And finally, simple luck matters more than either side would like to admit. Does that ancient power coupling hold when stressed by sudden reactivation? Does the boss's power claw land on a critical joint or glance off armor plating? Do the mech boys open the sarcophagus carefully or trigger some failsafe that wasn't designed to be breached by Xenos? In the grim darkness of the far future, even 20,000 years of sleep can't protect you from the whims of fate. The ancient warrior might wake to glorious battle and victorious death, or to desecration and horror beyond imagining, or to something stranger, something that no imperial doctrine or Ork tradition could have predicted. The only certainty is that when these two forces collide, the result will be violent, dramatic, and utterly in keeping with the tragic, brutal universe of Warhammer 40k. The aftermath and implications, regardless of which specific outcome occurs when Orks discover a 20,000-year-old Dreadnought. The aftermath carries implications that ripple far beyond the immediate participants. Let's explore what happens after the dust settles and examine what this scenario reveals about the broader universe of Warhammer 40k. If the Dreadnought destroys the Orks, the ancient warrior finds himself in a situation that might be worse than the battle itself. He's alive, he's awake, and he's stranded on a dead world with no way to contact his chapter, assuming his chapter even still exists. The victory, such as it is, leaves him alone with questions that have no good answers. What does a space marine do when he wakes up to find that the Imperium he knew is gone? When the battles he fought are ancient history? When everyone he served beside is long dead? The pilot would need to make his way off this world somehow, which means either waiting for Imperial forces that may never come, or attempting to repair whatever vessels the Orks arrived in and pilot them himself. A prospect that's nearly as daunting as the original battle, and if he does manage to return to Imperial space, what then? Does he search for his chapter, hoping against hope that they still exist? Does he present himself to the nearest space marine force and hope they recognize the validity of his ancient heraldry? Does he make his way to Terror itself, seeking answers from the Administratum about what happened during his long sleep? The bureaucratic nightmare alone would be staggering. Explaining to Imperial officials that you're a 20,000-year-old warrior who's been missing for longer than some chapters have existed would require documentation that probably doesn't exist anymore. The pilot might find himself quarantined for centuries while priests verify his machine, spirits' authenticity, and inquisitors investigate whether he's somehow been corrupted during his long isolation. If the Orks successfully loot the Dreadnought, the implications are equally troubling from an Imperial perspective. Now there's an Ork warband out there with access to technology that even most modern Space Marine chapters would struggle to replicate. The mech boys will learn from examining the ancient systems, and that knowledge will spread throughout the Ork network in the unpredictable way that Orkish technical expertise propagates. Worse, if the Orks manage to get the Dreadnought operational with one of their own as pilot, they've essentially created a super, Def Dread using Imperial technology. The combination of advanced Imperial engineering and Ork modifications could produce something truly terrifying. A walker that combines the durability and firepower of a Contemptor with the reckless aggression and crude effectiveness of Ork design philosophy. The pilot's fate in this scenario is almost too grim to contemplate. If he survives the Orks' ministrations, he might spend years, or even decades, trapped in his own chassis, while Orks use it for purposes that would make a mockery of everything he believes in. The psychological torture of being forced to witness the desecration of his sacred machine, form, powerless to stop it, might be worse than any physical damage he's endured. In the mutual destruction scenario, both sides have paid a terrible price. The Ork warband is decimated, their mission on this world likely compromised by the losses. The survivors will tell stories of the ancient Humi walker that took so many of them with it. Stories that will spread and become exaggerated in the telling until they become part of Ork legend. The Dreadnought's destruction means that another irreplaceable piece of the Imperium's past has been lost. The knowledge and experience contained in that ancient warrior's consciousness is gone forever. The chassis itself, which represented engineering at its zenith, is now just scrap metal scattered across a forgotten battlefield. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that nobody even knows to mourn this loss. Nobody is aware that a hero who served for longer than most civilizations endure has finally fallen. The unlikely alliance scenario, should it occur, creates problems for everyone involved. The ancient warrior would be compromised in ways that Imperial doctrine simply doesn't allow for. Cooperating with Xenos, even temporarily and for purely pragmatic reasons, is heresy of the highest order. If the pilot eventually returns to Imperial space, he would face immediate investigation and possible censure, or even destruction for his actions. The Orks, meanwhile, would be dealing with a volatile element in their midst. The ancient warrior isn't truly allied with them, just temporarily cooperating out of necessity. He's a ticking time bomb, always looking for the right moment to turn on them or escape. Smart Orks would recognize this and either try to bind him more securely or just get rid of him when he's no longer useful. But beyond the immediate participants, this scenario illuminates several broader truths about the Warhammer 40,000 universe that are worth examining. First, it demonstrates the incredible fragility of the Imperium's memory. A warrior can serve with distinction for centuries or even millennia, can be honored with entombment in a sacred Dreadnought chassis, and then simply be forgotten when circumstances change. The fortress where he rested was abandoned, its records lost, its significance erased by the passage of time. How many other heroes lie forgotten in tombs scattered across the galaxy? How much knowledge and experience has been lost simply because nobody remembered to wake the ancients? Second, it shows the relentless nature of Ork persistence. They came to a dead world looking for salvage and found one of the most advanced war machines the Imperium ever produced. The fact that they don't fully understand what they've found doesn't slow them down at all. They'll loot it, modify it, and use it, and in the process they'll learn just enough to make themselves more dangerous next time. Third, it highlights the tragic nature of Dreadnought existence. The ancient warrior didn't die with honor on the battlefield. He didn't even get to sleep eternally in an honored place in his chapter's fortress monastery. Instead, he was forgotten, left to sleep for geological periods of time, and then awakened only to face the worst possible circumstances. The honor of entombment, which is supposed to allow continued service to the Emperor, has instead resulted in isolation, abandonment, and ultimately either death or desecration. Fourth, it exemplifies the grimdark reality that defines this universe. There are no good outcomes here. Every scenario ends in tragedy, loss, or compromise. Victory for the Dreadnought means being stranded and alone with no clear path forward. Victory for the Orks means Imperial technology falling into Xeno's hands. Mutual destruction means pointless waste of valuable resources. Unlikely alliance means philosophical compromise that betrays fundamental principles. No matter what happens, everyone loses something important. From a broader perspective, this encounter represents a microcosm of the entire Warhammer 40k setting. The Imperium's glory days are long past, and what remains is often found in ruins, forgotten and vulnerable. The Xenos are always probing for weaknesses, always ready to exploit any advantage they can find. Individual heroism and sacrifice, no matter how profound, may ultimately mean nothing in the face of the galaxy's indifference. And the passage of time erodes even the most sacred institutions and traditions, leaving behind only fragments and ruins. The ancient warrior in our scenario believed he was serving a cause greater than himself. He accepted the curse of entombment because he thought his continued service mattered, that his tactical knowledge and battlefield experience would be valued and utilized for the Emperor's glory. And perhaps, for a time, it was. But 20,000 years is a long time. Empires rise and fall. Species evolve or go extinct. The very stars change their positions. And through it all, the warrior slept, dreaming dreams he couldn't remember, losing touch with the reality that continued without him. His service, no matter how dedicated, couldn't protect him from the simple fact that the galaxy moves on, that even the most carefully preserved heroes can be forgotten when new crises demand attention elsewhere. The Orks, meanwhile, represent a kind of eternal present. They don't worry about what happened 20,000 years ago. They don't agonize over lost glory or forgotten heroes. They just fight and loot and build, living completely in the moment, finding joy in the simple pleasures of violence and acquisition. In some ways, their existence is more honest than the Imperium's desperate clinging to past achievements. This encounter, then, becomes a collision between two fundamentally different relationships with time and purpose. The ancient warrior carries the weight of millennia, the burden of memory and duty across epochs. The Orks carry nothing but their immediate desires and the instinctive drive to fight and loot. When these two forces meet, the result is chaos, violence, and ultimately tragedy, and somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the Imperium, nobody will even notice. One more ancient hero lost. One more Ork warband growing slightly stronger. One more forgotten battlefield adding its contribution to the galaxy's endless catalogue of violence and waste. The universe doesn't care about individual tragedy, no matter how profound. It just keeps grinding forward, turning heroes and villains alike into dust and memory. This is the true horror at the heart of Warhammer 40,000. Not the monsters or the weapons or the endless warfare, but the simple fact that none of it matters in the end. Serve for 20,000 years, and you can still be forgotten. Fight with honor and skill beyond mortal comprehension, and you can still end up as Ork salvage. Sacrifice everything for a cause you believe in, and the cause itself might not even remember your name. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and sometimes, war forgets its own warriors. Conclusion: the eternal war. As we reach the end of this exploration into one of Warhammer 40,000's most fascinating hypothetical scenarios, it's worth reflecting on what makes this collision between ancient Imperial warrior and opportunistic Ork looters so compelling. It's not just the spectacle of the battle itself, though that's certainly dramatic enough. It's what the encounter reveals about the fundamental nature of existence in the 41st millennium. The ancient Dreadnought pilot represents a kind of tragic idealism that pervades the Imperium. He believed his service mattered. He accepted the curse of entombment because he thought his continued existence served a greater purpose. He endured the horror of being sealed into a machine, of losing his humanity piece by piece because he had faith that the Emperor's work was worth any sacrifice. And for 20,000 years, that faith sustained him through the darkness of stasis, through the brief violent awakenings, through the slow erosion of memory and identity. He believed that when he was needed, his chapter would call him forth. That his knowledge and experience would be valued, that his sacrifice would have meaning. The reality, as we've seen, is far crueler. The galaxy has moved on without him. His chapter may be gone. The enemies he trained to fight may no longer exist, or may have evolved into something he doesn't recognize. And his tomb, which should have been sacred and inviolate, has become just another piece of salvage on a forgotten battlefield, waiting for whoever comes along with the tools to crack it open. The Orks, by contrast, embody a kind of existential simplicity that's almost enviable. They don't worry about meaning or legacy, or the weight of history. They fight because fighting is fun. They loot because they want the shiny stuff. They build crude weapons and vehicles because they enjoy the process of creation, not because they're serving some higher purpose. An Ork's relationship with violence and destruction is pure and uncomplicated in a way that more sophisticated species can never achieve. When these two forces collide, the result is almost predetermined. The ancient warrior, no matter how skilled or powerful, is carrying too much weight. The weight of duty, of memory, of expectations that can never be fulfilled. The Orks carry nothing but their immediate desires and the simple joy of a good fight. That asymmetry, more than any difference in weapons or tactics, determines the encounter's fundamental character. This scenario also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of honor and duty in the Warhammer 40k universe. Is it truly an honor to be entombed in a dreadnought? The Imperium presents it as the highest blessing a warrior can receive, a chance to serve beyond death. But as we've seen, the reality is more complicated. The ancient warrior has served for 20,000 years, but most of that time has been spent in dreamless stasis, consciousness simply ceasing until external events demand its return. The brief periods of wakefulness have been consumed by violence, leaving no time for anything resembling a life. And now, awakening to find everything he knew gone, facing either destruction or desecration at the hands of enemies he despises, can we really call this a blessing? The grimdark nature of the setting demands that we acknowledge both perspectives simultaneously. Yes, the continued service is valuable. Yes, the knowledge and experience preserved in ancient dreadnoughts is irreplaceable. But also yes, the price paid by the pilots is horrific in ways that the Imperium rarely acknowledges. The horror and the honor coexist, inseparable and equally true. The Orks, meanwhile, demonstrate the setting's other great truth. That sometimes the simple approach is the most effective. They don't need to understand the sacred significance of what they've found. They don't need to appreciate the tragedy of awakening a warrior from 20,000-year sleep. They just need to evaluate whether it's worth looting, and if so, how to crack it open. This pragmatism, this complete absence of sentiment or reverence, makes Orks both terrifying and strangely refreshing. They cut through all the ceremony and significance that other species attach to their wars and just get on with the business of fighting. No philosophical agonizing, no questioning of purpose, just pure violent enthusiasm for its own sake. When we consider the possible outcomes of this encounter, we're really asking a broader question about what matters in the 41st millennium. Does individual heroism matter when the galaxy is so vast that entire wars can be forgotten? Does duty matter when those you serve might not even know you exist? Does preservation of knowledge matter when there's nobody left to value what's been preserved? The answer, frustratingly and appropriately for this setting, is both yes and no. The ancient warrior's service mattered to him, which is perhaps enough. The knowledge he preserved might be lost, but its existence, however brief, added something to the universe. The duty he fulfilled, even if nobody remembers, was real and meaningful in its own context. But also, from a certain perspective, none of it mattered at all. The galaxy is too large, time too long, the forces arrayed against humanity too vast. One warrior, no matter how skilled or dedicated, is ultimately just a drop in an ocean. And if that warrior happens to sleep for 20,000 years, only to be looted by Orks on a forgotten world, well, that's just another Tuesday in the 41st millennium. This is what makes Warhammer 40k so compelling. It refuses to provide easy answers or comfortable resolutions. The ancient Dreadnought pilot's story is tragic, yes, but it's also representative of countless similar tragedies playing out across the galaxy at every moment. The Orks' opportunistic looting is brutal, but it's also perfectly in character for a species that has survived and thrived through sheer adaptability and enthusiasm for violence. The encounter between these two forces becomes a window into the larger universe, revealing truths about service and sacrifice, about memory and forgetting, about the weight of history and the persistence of war. It shows us both the heights of heroism and the depths of tragedy, often in the same moment. And it reminds us that in the grim darkness of the far future, there truly is only war. War between species and within species. War across millennia and in single desperate moments. War that creates heroes and war that grinds them into forgotten dust. War that has meaning and war that's utterly pointless. All of it happening simultaneously, endlessly, without resolution or peace. The ancient warrior in his tomb represents the eternal soldier, serving a cause that may outlive him, but also may forget him. The Orks represent the eternal opportunist, taking advantage of whatever the galaxy provides, living in the moment without concern for larger meaning. When these two eternal archetypes collide, the result is perfectly, tragically, appropriately Warhammer 40,000. So what happens when Orks find a Dreadnought that's been asleep for 20,000 years? Everything and nothing, battle and tragedy, honor and horror. The preservation of ancient glory and its immediate desecration, individual heroism rendered meaningless by scale and time, yet somehow still mattering in the moment. In short, exactly what we'd expect from a universe where there is only war, and war, like time itself, cares nothing for the warriors it consumes. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40, Zalozen's most fascinating hypothetical scenarios, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We'll continue exploring the dark corners of the 41st millennium, examining the stories of warriors forgotten and remembered, of battles won and lost, and of all the tragedy and glory that defines this incredible universe. The Emperor protects, but sometimes protection comes too late. And the only mercy is the cold darkness of eternal sleep. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, even the dead can wake, and when they do, they might find that being forgotten was the Kender fate all along.